Going everybody, we're here back with another review. Today we're looking at David Sanger's New Cold Wars. I'm super excited to talk about this book. I had a pleasure reading this book. So let's just get right into it. This book is really tailored to a really specific audience. So if you want a book on U.S. foreign policy and global politics from the U.S. perspective, that is the book that you want to, this is a book for you. And I would say, for foreign policy, international relations, any of you students out there, this is a must read. This is up to date, and this will, there are some problems or some things amiss, but this is a must read, absolutely, for sure. And someone who really loves foreign policy and reading politics, this was a really, really good read. I actually am giving this a 4.25 out of 5 stars. Initially, I was giving it 4.5, but after sitting with it, I even went as low as 4, and then I'm like, let me get it in between. So 4.25 out of 5 stars, but again, tailored to a very, very specific audience. So kind of to give you a brief summary, this book traces how the past Cold War and like using the metaphor of a Cold War and using it to demonstrate this new Cold War between us and China. And then the book really talks about that, Russia and Ukraine, relationship with China, and yeah, those are the big ones. So that kind of summarizes it to its core. However, I will say that this new Cold War metaphor, I think, already paints a non-accurate picture. I mean, he goes into it a little bit from that we're reaching this new era of great power competition, but a Cold War just provides the wrong image, in my opinion. We are not really in a Cold War with China, but really in a tug of war of economic dominance, and that's kind of the new Cold War. Not really military dominance, although that's a part, obviously this is a part of the gig, but really with Russia, you had these ideological warfares, and a lot of countries, states caught up in between, but this is really an economic dominance. China's not really interested in a ideological dominance or a military dominance in certain areas. It's seeking economic dominance and learning from, let's say, U.S. capitalism, how that gave us economic dominance on much of the world. So this image is something going into it that I was, okay, I'm kind of disagreeing with this image. But he talks about more in this book that how the U.S., let's say, is being blinded by or is being too hopeful with its approach to Russia and China, that hope will be Russia will find a way to integrate itself, China will find a way to integrate itself into the international liberal system as we see it right now. And he's arguing that's just not been the case, especially with how the U.S. approached Russia's military buildup in Ukraine and all of these kinds of things, and even China, this kind of animus towards China. So these are all very, very interesting things to read. I mean, it's quite a long book, but I read it quite quickly because it was super, super interesting. He dives quite deep with his interviews with policymakers, people who worked in certain positions in the government. So the knowledge is really, really good. And he's making a lot of really, really interesting points, especially with the U.S. For the Russia-Ukraine part. I really found the drone warfare stuff super interesting. I really enjoyed reading about that to get an in-depth understanding, and also about how he went into a little bit of in-depth into what was the U.S. policy response during Russia's military buildup. So these things were super interesting. So again, if you're into U.S. foreign policy, this is definitely a book for you, and I would highly recommend it. Also, he makes another point. So going into China, I mean, he talks a lot about China in many different aspects, and again, in this power competition between the U.S. and China. But one of the main, one of the main assumptions he's making, or one of the main points he's making, this misguided assumption that China's economic rise would moderate its ambitions, and that Russia would become a manageable partner. And then obviously with Ukraine at the moment and China's economic dominance, this is not the case at all. And so two really interesting points in the China part was chips, like microchips, like in phones and computers and these kinds of things. And a specific example of China's economic dominance and in the Solomon Islands. So for this chip making, this book really went into depth about how the Biden administration and maybe later at the Trump administration's attempts they saw that chip making business, like the U.S. was losing on this front. China was stealing material, and not only that, but the U.S. was losing on the security agenda, on a economic agenda, chip making. And it's interesting how Taiwan, and he goes into it a little bit, I don't remember the specifics, about how Taiwan became the super powerhouse of chip making and balancing this, teetering on the balance of providing these to the U.S. and China. And this is very interesting about how the administration and the government authorities were really trying to push for U.S. chip making and the importance of this. And this was very fascinating to me, and how important and vital this is to U.S. security interests, U.S. economic interests, and the different policy agendas that were attempted or made, some successful and not successful, to challenge China on this, and how some companies left and the U.S. had to subsidize certain things. So if this sounds interesting to you, definitely read this. And for the Chinese economic dominance, and the lack of U.S. there's a specific example of the Solomon Islands, where the U.S. embassy withdrew, and kind of China swooped in and said, okay, we'll provide you like a significant economic package to the Solomon Islands if you do certain things for us. And the big one was do not recognize Taiwan as a country or as an independent state. And the Solomon Islands felt a little bit abandoned by the U.S. Because the funds have been withdrawn from the embassy and these kinds of things. And now they have this economic package with China, and I think some of the residents were very displeased about this because a lot of Solomon Islands people were getting very cheap healthcare in Taiwan. So anyway, I'm currently residing in Iraqi Kurdistan, and seeing China making its economic dominance power moves here is very much in relation to this, with their importing of cars here, jobs, businesses, these kinds of things. So that's really interesting, and those two kinds of things jumped out to me about the U.S. is maybe focusing on the wrong things from a U.S. policy perspective. And China's done this with this building of this new Silk Road, and then in states in the continent of Africa, this kind of economic debt policy to assure dominance on states. And certain states are taking these deals, and then they are in debt, and China have to do what they want to do. But anyway, this is very, very interesting how he goes into this, and he does quite the excellent job going into this. But to be fair, he does go into how the tools and the terrain of this new Cold War are significantly different than before, and then perhaps that the U.S. approach is archaic and is not up to date. Supply chains, diplomacy, these kinds of things are not up to date in this kind of battle or Cold War with China. So. And he talked about how the stakes are higher and more complex and these kinds of things. So again, really, really interesting read. again, specifically for a target audience. And again, remember, this is very much from a U.S. perspective, I will call it a U.S. positivist perspective, assuming that the U.S. is leading this international liberal system that is in the interest of the global society, which obviously a lot of people might not see it that way. So just keep that in mind. But if you're specifically into the U.S. foreign policy, U.S. International policy, international relations, this book is a must-read, especially if there's any students watching these. You have to read this book. It's a must-read 100%. So yeah, super, super interesting. Those are kind of the major points. He really goes in depth, like into the chip manufacturing. For example, here I have a quote, like, Taiwan's emergence as a critical hub, the most important supply chain in the world, was the result of remarkable confluence of events, unusually skillful and well-timed planning by Taiwan. And this guy that was educated in MIT, who left Texas Instruments, we all use their calculators, and started this in Taiwan. And this chip making stuff is really crazy, and I would highly suggest just for that part. It's very interesting. And then going into China's this Taiwan thing is very interesting, that more and more countries are not recognizing Taiwan, and that China definitely has this long view going forward economically and even militarily. This new way of warfare, the State Department officials showed how Ukrainian soldiers are using 3D printers on the rear lines of the battlefields to replace out artillery batteries, drones, battery packs, like these kinds of things, and this rapid development of drone warfare, which even recently now Russia's find a way to counteract this, is quite interesting. And then something I didn't know was that Turkey, negotiated an export grain deal, this called Black Sea Grain Initiative, to keep the export of wheat shipments going. So Russia and Ukraine being two of the world's largest wheat exporters, that I found really interesting. And then some immediate risks that he goes to that dominate America's dealings with Xi Jinping's government is the first is that a future U.S. administration will abandon our current technological strategy, despite early signs that it's beginning to work, in reference to the chip making. So far, the aggressive mix of investments in developing technologies at home with increasing control of sensitive exports to Chinese firms has prompted Xi Jinping's strongest protest. The danger is not simply a reversal of that strategy, but a failure to drive it forward. A second risk is that Washington could go too far with its sanctions and tariffs, and look at the tariffs at the moment, and play right into Xi's argument that America's real goal is containment, encirclement, and suppression. Not every Chinese advance is a Sputnik moment. When China masters the technology to manufacture chips with 3-nanometer circuits, or celebrates a leap in artificial intelligence or space launchers, there will be calls to react and most likely overreact. And we are kind of seeing this too. So that's really interesting that he made this point. I forget when this book is written exactly. And the third risk is that some combination of America's overheated rhetoric and its enthusiasm for new sanctions, America and its allies unintentionally drive Russia and China closer together. Washington already has a severe case of anti-China animus bordering on unchecked xenophobia. As elections approach, there's an easier political target than the Chinese Communist Party. At the end of 2023, there was already some talks in Congress that the combination of Russia and China, and along with Iran, constituted an axis of evil that America needed to deal with. What's missing in this overheated debate is a real strategy for driving a wedge in the emerging partnership between Beijing and Moscow. And so that this will require a combination of cunning diplomatic nuance. So yeah, super, super interesting. And I think I would really suggest, if you do decide to read this book, going into this book being reflective, have these questions in mind, like what is U.S. security national? What is U.S. national security interest? What is the global national security interest? How does the U.S. achieve its U.S. national security interests, and who benefits from it and who doesn't? And what are the different strategies? If you're kind of reflecting on this while you're reading this, you'll get really, really good things out of this. So again, these misplaced assumptions about the post-Cold War, different adversaries, different strategies, technological, economic leverage, and soft power as battlegrounds. This is the best way to kind of encapsulate this. And yeah, this Cold War metaphor is my big criticism of this, and kind of with Russia and Ukraine and China, although he provides these narratives of the new Cold War, I would have liked to have seen more analysis about how these are all intertwined and what that might mean for the future. I would have liked more analysis of this because he's quoting a lot of policymakers and these things. But yeah, I think this is kind of a book you read to get a lot of information and fair analysis at sometimes, and then be able to develop your own understanding, because these things are highly complex, and in some ways this is kind of oversimplified. So yeah, I would suggest, like again, it's 4.25 out of 5 stars. So again, I learned a lot, and I wouldn't read this again because these things get quickly outdated. But again, definitely highly suggest. So thanks again for listening. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. I'm very curious. So yeah, thank you.